Thanks everyone. Thank you, Gustavo, Gianluca. Thank you all for this new opportunity to be here. Misano is to me now a familiar and important place because, in my opinion, it always proposes ways of cultural working, of cultural communication, which are always very intelligent, meaningful, enjoyable. I hope so. In the enjoyment of the spirit, because I think that the spirit has a unique great enemy, which is boredom. Therefore, today I will try to do a synthetic reading of Nietzsche's thought. I will try to keep my presentation within an hour, not to kill you. And afterwards, I hope we will have the opportunity for a dialogue to further deepen this topic, and we'll try to fill some gaps that I think will be there. I also will try to make, as Gustavo mentioned before, a synthetic reflection of Nietzsche's thought, as I think that here is the beginning of the 21st century. I think it's time to deal with these kind of thoughts in a simple way and to face this thought a bit more seriously, to consider it again after some decades in which Nietzsche's thought has been quoted, analyzed, but never really taken seriously as Nietzsche himself wished. So, let's say Nietzsche, as you know, he wanted to do philosophy with a hammer, as reported in the subtitle of the Twilight of the Idols. He didn't really like the academic and philosophical nuances which already existed at his time, and then I think, unfortunately, I would say, have been increasing right about his thinking. Just to remind you what Zarathustra thinks about this kind of this way of thinking that goes around reducing in dust all the most powerful and thunderous words of the history. I want to remind you what Zarathustra said about the erudites. And he says, I am burning too much with my own thoughts, and often I lack my breath. Then I need to go outside, away from the dusty rooms, but they sit in a fresh shadow. They want to only be spectators, and they're careful to sit on stairs warmed by the sun, like those people who are on the way and look in laziness the people passing by, so they also linger waiting for thought by others. If a hand barely touches them, they will be reduced into dust. But who would have ever thought that this dust is coming from the wheat and from the delicate golden summer fields? So therefore, if tonight we will discuss about Nietzsche's philosophy with a hammer, I will try to be loyal to Nietzsche's thought. Nietzsche, in my opinion, has to be taken seriously. His proposal for a humanity, I believe that nowadays, after a century of work analysis that gave us some political and social effects, we must ask ourselves if this proposal is still valid, if we should follow it, if we might consider that Nietzsche's viewpoint represents the evolutional destiny of humanity on this planet. This is precisely what Nietzsche wanted. This was its level, so nothing less than reorient the whole history of the world. This was his intention. You could just pick up one of his latest books, like 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗜𝗓, which is autobiographical, and we can realize this. In 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓, Nietzsche wrote, "I know my destiny. There will be a day in which my name will be connected and remind of something terrible, of a crisis that never happened before, the most tremendous shock of the conscience. Everything that has been pronounced against, all what has been believed, pretended, and sanctified until that moment. I am not a man, I am dynamite. I only discovered the truth because I have been the first one to listen to the lie as a lie." So do you understand? This is Nietzsche's ambition. This is what he considered to bring in the world history. And I'd say that I was fascinated back then. I met Nietzsche, like many others, when I was a teenager, around my 17, 18, and I lived with Nietzsche 7 years long. I only read Nietzsche, reading everything around Nietzsche, about Nietzsche, also because everything else seemed so meaningless to me after reading him. So everything else really seemed to me inconsistent to me, like ashes. Only he had this power in the thinking, this radically powerful thought that gave me a sense of reality. He gave me a sense of reality. Tonight, we will try to take 3 short steps. We'll try to stand in front of Nietzsche's proposal, his upheaval of the thinking, and we'll try to evaluate if this proposal can really be a desirable future for us and the whole humanity. Even here, we will go by the hammer. So we will follow the teaching of the master, and indeed we will betray him. You know that Zarathustra says that who really learn his lesson will then leave him, will betray him. That's why there are many people studying Nietzsche around the world, but there are really few disciples of Nietzsche. The university are plenties, and the libraries are plenties of books by Nietzsche, but really few people follow Nietzsche's teaching. Well then, very good. First, Nietzsche, as you know, starts from a very strong feeling of the end. Nietzsche feels that the entire humanity is about to face a final phase in its history. This is the very first statement of Zarathustra, and do you remember? It says, "I will announce to you the 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗔𝗟, which means something that goes beyond man." So, man, and this was translated as Superman, but actually it's not the right expression. It's something that goes beyond the man. Do you remember that? So the man has to be overcome, and this is, the tense rope between a monkey and the beyond man. So this is a turning point, an anthropological transition, and this is what really Nietzsche is saying in Zarathustra. That is, that the time is over, and it's opening a new time. It's perfectly concise with the first words of the Christ. If you remember, Christ in the Gospel of Mark says, the time is fulfilled, God's kingdom is coming, is close, convert and believe to the Gospel. So to this beautiful and new message. By the way, Nietzsche says, I am the glad nuncio, I am the gospel, I am the gospel, I am giving you the truly beautiful message. So keep always in mind and bear in mind that there is always a frightening parallelism between Zarathustra and the gospel, between Zarathustra and Christ, between Christ and the Antichrist, because this is really the problem in Nietzsche. So the first fundamental starting point of Nietzsche's thought is the perception of an end, that there is an end to be faced soon. The perception that whole Europe swarms with people that can be called the lost men, the lost human beings, one lost generation before the beyond men, and it's the worst time. Let's describe it. Let's us read first, and Gianluca will help us reading a passage in which Nietzsche, Zarathustra, describes a little bit of this condition of the lost human beings in which we all at the end are. And thus spoke Zarathustra unto the people. It is time for man to fix his goal. It is time for man to fix his goal. It is time for man to plant the germ of his highest hope. Still is his soil rich enough for it, but that soil will one day be poor and exhausted, and no lofty tree will any longer be able to grow thereon. Alas, there come the time when man will no longer launch the arrow of his longing beyond men, and the string of his bow will have unlearned to wheeze. I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. I tell you, you still have chaos within yourselves. Alas, there come the time when men will no longer give birth to any star. Alas, there come the time of the most despicable man who can no longer despise himself. I show you the lost men. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asks the lost man and blinks. The earth have then become small, and on it there hopes the lost man who makes everything small, his species ineradicable like that of the ground flea. The last man lives longer. We have discovered happiness, say the lost men, and they blink. A little poison now and then gives pleasant dreams, and a lot of poison at last for a pleasant death. One still works, for work is considered a pastime, but one is trying also carefully not to be hurt by this pastime, one no longer become poor or rich. Both are too burdensome. Who still wanted to rule? Who still wants to obey? Both actions are too burdensome. No shepherd is one herd. Everyone wants the same things. Everyone is the same. Who feels differently goes voluntarily into the xylem. In the past, all the world was insane. Say, the most intelligent of them. We are clever, and we know everything that has happened. So, there is no end to this. People still fight against each other, but then soon reconcile, and everyone has little pleasures for the day, and then these little pleasures for the night, but they also take care of their else. We have discovered happiness, say the last man, and blink thereby. So, well, this is, let us say, the vision of the last human beings. I also would like to tell you that, the last people that studied Nietzsche are very similar to the latest man. They understood very little about him. They believed that Nietzsche was a democratic person, an aesthetic person, let us say. Nietzsche was a crazy man, was mad, was a poet, was a fool. He was not a realistic person. He was not an atheist in the 20th century way of thinking. It's too trivial. From the country of culture, Zarathustra said, "You are living consultations of your own faith and destroyer of all thinking. I call you unworthy of fate, lord of the reality. You are sterile, therefore you lack fate, but those who had to create, they also always believed in fate and have the prophecies." So, spoke Zarathustra, let us not reduce Nietzsche to the very small microscopic measures of the last 30 years of philosophy. Nietzsche has other perspective. The first one, we already seen it is to be an anthropological revolution of the history of the planet. So, second point, what is Nietzsche's diagnosis? In other words, why, according to Nietzsche, humanity has arrived to this shameful poorness and poverty in creativity. So what really Nietzsche suffered the most was this lack of creativity, the lack of cultural creativity in Europe. Nietzsche's answer is very clear and simple. And it's always the same from the beginning until up to the end of his thought. He's very coherent. Is characterized actually by this great coherence. Sometimes he might seem ambiguous, as he sometimes is, but he's complex. And so the diagnosis is always the same. Nietzsche's diagnosis about the decadence of human culture is that it was determined by the success of the slave's moral, which is a lie, the lie of which Nietzsche always spoke. So, human civilization declined progressively when this enslavement enslaves morality, actually, won. The morality of the weaks, of the losers, that has progressively transformed the moral values of the strong people, of the aristocracy. They transformed it into a sense of guilty. So slaves have actually diminished the importance of human virtues, which are the one of the strength, and it has radically then changed human culture, bringing humanity to its decadence. This is his thinking. Sometimes reading him, it seems that he wants to criticize the late 19th century middle class moralistic hypocrisy. It seems to be this the point, but actually he specifies very clearly that Nietzsche wants to attack to the very heart the human moral education as a whole, as it developed in its relevant during the time, during history, showing that this moral leads actually to deny the deepest and true aspects of life, which is the will of power. This is the diagnosis. We can take many books, but one of the most explicit, and it's always good to have Nietzsche here with me, here in its philosophy of morality, he summarizes it very good. So if it's true what we actually now believe, that the meaning for every civilization is to be able to breed the ferocious beast that human beings are, turning it into a meek and civilized animal, that it makes him similar to a pet, then it should be considered without any doubt all those instincts of reaction, resentment that actually helped the aristocrats to be actually diminished, and then they felt also guilty for that. Namely, so the instrument of civilization are the means through which the slaves made actually the aristocrats feel that their human virtues were not important, and they made them feel guilty. So considering also the pre-Aryan population, so not European populations, so those people, they represent the regression of humanity. These tools of civilizations, quote and unquote, are the shame of human beings, and they're rather a suspicion and an argumentation against civilization in general. In other words, he also says, you may also have all the rights not to free yourself from fear in front of the blonde beast nestled in the bottom of all aristocratic race. This is actually, you may also fear, you may be terrified in front of this human beast beyond good and evil, but who would not prefer the terror 100 times more if it was to be combined with admiration and not the luck of it? And now it's impossible to get rid of this nauseating spectacle of aborted, intoxicating, miserable beings. Is this clear? So spoke Zarathustra, and this is his diagnosis. Third part. We are at the end. Decadence led the human civilization to its end. This decadence was determined by the victory of the slave's moral of resentment, as Nietzsche calls it, against the true great aristocratic morality that has become now guilt, has felt guilt and dissolved. So sometimes it came up again, for example, during the Roman Empire, in certain moments of the Italian Renaissance, and maybe in Prince Valentino, and something perhaps also was to see in Napoleon. And if this is all true, the Übermensch, so the beyond man, is the one that then frees himself from all these values. And this is actually what he's speaking about. This is the destiny that Nietzsche is pointing out. Now, to be more precise, the Übermensch needs to destroy something to demonstrate that there is a big lie, and it is that what Nietzsche sees as the enslavement morality, the Judaic-Christian tradition, actually, which, according to him, is the triumph in the world of the most radical moral of the slaves, of the victims. The vision of the world seen through the victim's eyes. A God who is victim, crucified. This is the greatest triumph of decadence, and this is also actually the greatest enemy for Zarathustra. We must destroy Christianity to have the Übermensch. And also about this, Nietzsche is absolutely coherent and very clear. So this Jesus of Nazareth, the living gospel of love, the Savior, who brings victory and blessings to the poor and the sick, beatitude and victory. Actually, he represented the seduction in its most sinister and irresistible form, the seduction and tortuous path towards those values of the Jewish renewal and their ideal. Has not Israel reached the very crossroads of this Savior, this apparent opponent, the dissolver of Israel, the supreme end of its sublime thirst for revenge? Is it not perhaps, like mysterious black magic, a really great policy of revenge, a far-sighted underground revenge that progresses slowly according to calculated programs? For example, the fact that Israel itself wanted to deny, to nail to the cross before the whole world this person, just the instrument of his own vengeance. And on the other side, on the other hand, who could possibly think with all the subtle spirit about a more dangerous thing than this? Can something be more intoxicating and ruinous, similar to this symbol of the Holy Cross? This terrifying paradox of a God on the cross, this mystery of the inconceivable, extreme cruelty, and this self-crucifixion of God for the salvation of man. It is certain, at least, 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓, that Israel has continued since then to triumph with its revenge, with its subversion to all these values and over all these ideals, over all other noblest ideals. Is this clear? So the Christ represents the culmination of the slave morality and the potential destruction of any aristocratic morality, that is, of any truth. The truth is the truth of the force, of the will of power. The truth manifests itself in human societies when it manifests itself as a power. The slaves, the powerless, celebrate the virtues of weakness because they are powerless. Here is the revenge of the weak, of the meeks, the revenge of the mediocre, the revenge of the slaves, the sick. Do you understand? Around this topic, Nietzsche is fossicking his work, and everything else is just literature. Not taking this into consideration is actually not talking about Nietzsche's work. And doing something else is doing your own philosophy, but it's not Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a very serious person. And I also believe that our life nowadays is also revolving around this topic. We should then decide, having possibly in mind clear alternatives, having alternatives in mind, freed from what is vague and brought back to their seriousness, serious reality. Nietzsche is very serious. According to him, there is the alternative is very clear. You know how Ecce Homo then ends up. Before the poems, he says, "Was I understood Dionysus against the crucifix?" So, do you understand me? Dionysus against the crucifix. Namely, it is the image of God. And to each image of God, we have a form of humanity. Depending on how we human being think of God, then we build up our relationship. And Nietzsche is very consistent. He goes all the way down towards embracing his dramatic opposition to the Christ. So he does not limit himself to criticize. It would be very easy, the deviation of Christianity. And it's very simple today. Even the Pope criticizes the deviations of Christianity. No, Nietzsche goes all the way. He exalted the instinct of extermination, the violence of aristocratic classes. He also legitimized slavery and new forms of man farming, and he accused modernity, democracy, and each form of egalitarianism, socialism to be the extreme products of the same moral of the Judaic-Christian enslavement and mentality. And Nietzsche is absolutely politically not correct. He does not care about being accepted, and he also exalted a type of mankind, among other things, we will understand. It was radically different from what he was, and this is Nietzsche's drama, and it will bring it to madness. We'll see it later. Now, let's have a look on what is the type of man that he describes. What kind of man, human being, should come from the destruction of the Christianity. Just take into account that when I was 20, actually, I wrote Why the Antichrist, and it's an apology of the Antichrist. So I know this very well. I have it within myself. I am not struggling to say what I say. Then you will have to see and to decide what is correct or what is not correct. And at a certain point of my life, I understood that it was not true. But you have to make a decision. So, do you understand me? Was I clear? Dionysus against the crucifix, not science, right? Not rationality. This is not Nietzsche, it's Dionysus. Dionysus beyond good and evil. Here you must consider the thing to their very roots and pay attention to any sentimental weakness. Life is essentially appropriation, offense, oppression against the stranger and the weakest. Strict imposition of one's forms, assimilation, and in the best case scenario, exploitation. Exploitation does not just belong to a corrupt and imperfect primitive society, it belongs to the essence of the living as a fundamental organic function. To deny all this is the morality of the slaves. Denying this is to mislead human beings. Denying this is Christianity. But it belongs to the essence of the living as a fundamental organic function. It's a consequence of the very will of power, that it's the very will of life. So, is life, so things work. So going against this means to go against life, against the truth, and create all the preconditions for a decadent civilization like ours. As 𝗦𝗘𝗥𝗜𝗙𝗟 reminds us, Nietzsche has come to reconsider the human sacrifice in the posthumous fragments 88, 89 he wrote. The individual was held by Christianity in such an important way, placed in such an absolute podium that it could no longer be sacrificed. But the species consist and exist only thanks to human sacrifices. True philanthropy wants to sacrifice for the good of the species. And it's hard and full of self-overcome because it needs the sacrifice of man. And this pseudo-humanism called Christianity wants to reach a point at which there is no sacrifice. Can you understand me? Dionysus against the crucifix. Have I made myself clear? Dionysus against the sacrifice. The crucifix. Dionysus is a god, and we must know him, and we must understand him well and understand what he thinks. So, very good. Now, we discussed about three main features. Starting point, the end of time, the diagnosis, the moral of the slaves, which has prevailed, and then the therapy, destroy Christianity, which was the triumph of that mentality in order to free the Übermensch. Now, there is a big problem. Actually, this big problem, which is rather a tragedy, it's Nietzsche's life, Nietzsche as a person. And this is one maybe of the main this is one of the main things that made me love him so much. It's about his life. and I still love him. He was my teacher. I think he's my teacher, and still is my first teacher, and I will never forget. He always said that the messenger must be perfectly, must be the perfect messenger. So we must return to pre-Socratic school. We should go to the schools where philosophy is taught by the people, so the philosophers that really do and believe what they're preaching. I want to see your doctrine that becomes flesh in your daily routine and makes you happy. And this is what Zarathustra says. And he insists, but this is the problem. Nietzsche is completely different from the Übermensch that he is showing us. He was a very sensitive man, a typical representative of the decadence, and a man that couldn't even hurt a fly, hypersensitive and neurotic, with very strong psychosomatic diseases caused by this hypersensitivity. He looks just like, the loser, these patients, these weak and meek people that he's describing. He is not the beast, the blonde beast. He's not an officer of the SS. He is the one that is refused and it's a failure. He is chaste. Go and read now, we don't have time, and he is naming some fundamental virtues of every creative act. And he reconsiders chastity. He was saying, I am Dionysus. Oh my God, there is a great contradiction. So there is a great difference between what Nietzsche is writing about and is saying to us about, and then his life and who he really is. I want to read only a few lines so that you will feel the spiritual, emotional contradictions in Nietzsche's soul, and you will understand how he was in his life. In Turin, people called him the saint for his lifestyle, the way of living. You know that he is considered crazy, mad, because he embraces a horse that was whipped. It was a man that would never even sacrifice a fly, I guarantee you. I read everything about him. He was a very kind man. And this is terrible, because this was really crazy. He was so gentle, but then he's talking about the Übermensch, and I want to write you a few things that make me feel him alive. I'm reading 2 letters. This is the person who wrote The Curse of Christianity. Now it's Genoa, December 25th, 1880. He's writing to his sister and mother. Today, my deeply beloved, it's Christmas. New Year's is at the door, and this letter must be written if my gentleman's eyes, even if my gentleman's eyes are protesting, because poor man, his sight was not good. Yesterday I was lying on the bed and I was thinking about life when I came to the conclusion that many things are incomplete, and often there is, you must grit your teeth. Therefore, we should take every opportunity to say a few good words and do a little good gentleness to each other. He's crazy, huh? Where is the moral of the slaves? So, that something beautiful can come out of this existence of ours. And in the meantime, it occurred to me that I never went to visit Aunt Cecilia. So where is this blonde beast, the human sacrifice? And also that with my impatience and my sulks, I poisoned you all last fall. So I want to read another part because it's important to understand how was his personality. Do you see that I love him? This lecture is from 85, and he already wrote Zarathustra and Beyond the Good and Evil. Now, but my Christmas really did succeed on a feast day. At noon, I had your dear gifts, and I immediately put around my neck the chain of the Holy Virgin, and the calendar disappeared in the pocket of my waistcoat. Evidently, at that moment, the money went off away, because maybe they put money in the letter. If there was money in the letter, please forgive your little blind who wanted to open the package on the street. It is likely that something slipped away, given the intentions with which I opened the letter. Let us hope that a poor lady was nearby and found on the street the gift of the bambino, so the baby Jesus. So Nietzsche's problem, it's a big one and concerns us all. Perhaps his philosophical denial of Christianity clashed within himself with a Christian flesh that he could not perceive and recognize philosophically. These led him to an antithesis, to a frontal attack of Christianity that cannot recognize within himself, and he sees outside in degraded forms that lead him to exaggerate his rebellion up to, as you know, madness. But this is just an hypothesis. What is clear is that he criticizes every idea of God, of ultimate purpose, of eternity, but then he invokes heaven, asks for eternity, for its joy. He confesses to seek and look for a purpose. He always projects himself beyond men and human beings, and deeply despises human beings that do not go beyond themselves, as you heard. So do not exchange Nietzsche's words and work for someone who wants to limit us here, okay? So Dionysus is always a god, and it's a savior god that he understands with all the consequences that we have seen. We could also say that Nietzsche is totally devoured by the mystery of a new humanity, a freer one, a happier one. He feels this, and this is his greatness, and this makes him very up-to-date. And I wrote a book called The New Humanity, so I feel also myself a her of his foresights. It's true that a new figure of humanity is emptying, and something new is struggling, and truer is struggling to emerge in us, that can surpass, that can go beyond the figure of a God lawgiver that judges us, that condemns us, that persecute us, that limit us. So Nietzsche is pervaded by all this, but he claims to build this beyond humanity against his archetype, against his archetype. What is the archetype of the new humanity in the history of the world? So we don't have to create that. There is one. It is the Christ. So Christ himself presents as the new humanity. This divine human that is finally free by a God that crashes us, that clashes against us, completely free, and in a certain sense beyond good and evil, beyond the law. So the drama that Nietzsche has, in my opinion, is all here. He carries this archetype within himself, but does not recognize it and opposes it. That's why he is writing the Antichrist, because he is inside the sphere of this archetype. Otherwise, you cannot write the Antichrist. You know that Nietzsche decides to publish the Antichrist at the end of November 88, and January 3rd he goes crazy. He who taught us to observe the events, predictions, coincidences, this should also give us an important information, right? Jaspers understood very well the inner conflict within this archetype of the Christ, the rejection of this archetype, the counterfiguration of the archetype, the attempt at least to imagine a humanity that goes beyond and it's anti-Christian as a religious drama that, I want to repeat, does not only belong to Nietzsche's. If it was only Nietzsche's problem, we would probably not be here and talk about that. That this is not only Nietzsche's problem was very well demonstrated by the whole 20th century. Soon after his death, the whole Europe will be overwhelmed by so many Herren, so many gentlemen who thought they were following Zarathustra, who thought, they were bringing the book in their backpacks, they were reading it, they felt supported by reading it. So I was quoting Jaspers. You see, Jaspers is very interesting because he was not just a great philosopher, he was also a psychiatrist, therefore he can analyze the problem that Nietzsche had from both point of views, a philosophical one as well as a psychological one. Also Jung did it, and I will read also something about Jung. Jaspers writes on Nietzsche this: when someone blames on Nietzsche is atheism and reminds us is Antichrist, one should think that the atheism in Nietzsche is not a unique and vulgar denial of God, neither the indifference of those who are far from God, for whom God does not exist because they do not seek Him at all. It's not this. The way in which Nietzsche remarks that for his time God is dead, it represents the expression of his emotion and his honesty. And then he reaches a radical denial of every faith in God. Even then, he remains extraordinarily close to Christianity. And here he quotes a letter to Peter Gast, written by Nietzsche in 81. Nietzsche writes, the Christianity. So Christianity is, however, the best element of ideal life that I have really ever known. You understand well? He was not. He was really split into two. But, he said Christianity was the triumph of decadent morality that brought humanity to destruction. But actually, then since childhood, he says, I followed, him in many ways. So if we're going to take Nietzsche seriously again, you understand, Dionysus against the crucifix, I would say that once again in the history of the world and the West, we're in front of a clear crossroad that we could summarize in this matter. Ego non Christus, this is the apotheosis, ego non Christus, or like St. Paul said, non ego Christus. Nietzsche is on this razor blade. So it says non-ego. So it denies the old humanity, the old form of self, of ego. But it's like as if it says non-ego, ego, non-ego, hyper-ego. And this is the tragedy that, in my opinion, it's very present today as well for us. What is the new humanity, or the humanity we want to build? Can we, like Nietzsche was, when we criticize Christianity in the very heart, not in the superficial things, can we be completely coherent? So, where are we? Which side are we taking? Are we the victims, or are we the executioners? Let's say Nietzsche is with the authority and on the side of the strong ones, the dominators. Do we realize that being on the side of the victims is not neutral? But it has a story, it comes from a very precise story, it's a vision of the divine and the human, and Nietzsche makes us recognize it very well. So do we want to choose this path again? So then let's do that, but let's recognize also the archetype, let's recognize the God we are worshipping. There is no need to believe or not to believe in an ideological sense, to feel that this is the way of truth, that being on the side of the victims is truth itself. But this is not neutral, it does not fall from heaven, and it does not come from thinking and reasoning. It's the result of a revelation, of an event, a fact in history, which we must recognize if we want to continue with them, because history will give us many challenges, and the 21st century, in my opinion, will be a lot of fun, I would say. Next challenges will be equally radical, and again, we will have to choose Dionysus or the crucifix. What is our side? And we will soon understand that there is no third alternative. There are only two possibilities, and we can call it in many different ways, but there are not a lot. Jung. Jung understood very well the psychic problem that Nietzsche had. And he says, Nietzsche was not an atheist, but his God was dead. The result of this death was an inner split in Nietzsche's himself. For this reason, he felt obliged to personify his other self in Zarathustra. Since God was dead, then he must become God. And this is called inflation and can lead to insanity. It is the identification with the self from the Jungian point of view. So he felt obliged to personify himself in Zarathustra, or in other moments as Dionysus. During his fatal illness, he signed his letter as Zagreus, the god Dionysus, dismembered by the Thracians. The tragedy of Zarathustra is that since his god died, Nietzsche himself became a god. I alone have discovered the truth, 𝗟𝗓𝗦𝗖𝗔𝗍 latest statement. And it happened because he was not an atheist. He was characterized by a too positive nature to be able to bear the metropolitan neurosis called atheism. So for Jung, atheism is just a neurosis of the big cities, of the big industrial agglomerates. It does not exist where man lives in contact with nature. There is not this form, at least. The one for whom God dies will succumb to inflation. And this is also, if you want, a psychiatric diagnosis of Nietzsche's madness. Well, After all these years of works, comparison, learning of Nietzsche's thoughts, my personal answer is that precisely the Antichrist, as the word says, is a counterfigure. The Antichrist is just a counterfigure. Nietzsche is pervaded by the mystery of Christ. He will then call his last book Ecce Homo, you see, Ecce Homo. And perhaps it is time in this very difficult moment of history to listen to the original, the archetype, to find in the archetype all the evolutionary and positive elements that even Nietzsche understood in his Übermensch, beyond man, that are still valid. Not the unilateralities and degenerations to which he progressively and gradually will then give in. There, a subtle work of discernment must be done. From a certain point of view, Nietzsche had grasped these crossroads very well, and I believe that there was a point in his life during 82 or 83. I think he could have taken, in a way, a certain different road. He could have, at a certain point, have listened more to his deepest dimensions, to be more of a poet. Zarathustra is a poet, and I'm catching this, I'm understanding this before the third and fourth part of the Zarathustra, which is named The Great Desire. So I have this impression that in that very moment his destiny was made. He decided not to listen to that. He couldn't, maybe. He did not want to do that. I don't know. He didn't put himself in a more humble attitude with respect to this mystery. He perceived that there was the possibility to listen deeply, and he felt the possibility of this listening as an integration and help to his more sweeter, delicate, and poetic parts. Those one who, he's writing about in the letters to his mother and sister, and instead he decided the way of the curse, the opposition, the violence, and of his last works. I think this is something that it's very important, and it has a lot of meaning for all of us. I think that is in this phase of a huge transformation. I think we can also nowadays listen to the deepest dimension of my flesh. It's a simplification. What does my heart sing about? What does my heart really need and want? What satisfies me? What do I really need? So listening, singing, to be humble, these are all ways that Zarathustra does not follow, and maybe we could follow. So now, let me finish by reading this page read by Gianluca. Großes Sehnsucht, actually translated as a great desire, but in German Sehnsucht is much more than desire. It's a yearning, a deep yearning. Let's say it's that yearning that constitutes us as human beings. And indeed, my soul, who, seeing your smile, would not melt down into tears. Even the angels are melting in tears on the affluent goodness of your smile. Your goodness, your flowing goodness, is the one who does not want to complain and cry, yet your smile, my soul, yearns for tears, and your trembling mouth yearns to sob. Isn't every cry a complaint, and every complaint a blaming? So you speak to yourself, and therefore, my soul, you would rather smile than vent your pain, pour it out in copious tears, all your pain on your fullness and your tension of lives towards the winemaker and his knife of the vineyard. But if you don't want to cry, you don't want to cry all the tears of your melancholy, you will have to sing, my soul. Here I myself laugh, predicting this. Sing with immense song until all the seas are silenced to listen to your longing. Until on longing silent seas the boat will sleep away the golden prodigy around whose this gold dart. All things are going to run bad strange, even the many big and small animals, all that has a light and a strange feet that is able to run through the paths of a violet towards the golden wonder, the free boat with a master. But this is the winemaker who waits with a knife of diamond, your great deliverer, my soul, without a name, whose name will be given only to future songs, and indeed your breath already stings for future songs. Already you burn, and your burns and dreams already drink thirsty to all the deeping resonant sources of comfort. Already your melancholy rests in the bliss of future songs, O my soul. All now I have given to you, even my last thing, and empty because of you are now my ends. Ordering you to sing, that was my last thing. Ordering you to sing. But now speak, speak. Who must be thankful? Or better still, sing, sing, my soul, and let me thank. Thus spoke Zarathustra. So now, after this beautiful moment, the debate is open. If you have any questions for Marco Guzzi, we're here to try and answer them. So, you have the floor. Thank you, Professor, for this beautiful conference and talk around Nietzsche. I also like him very much. I wanted to ask you something. So, in this so-called anthropological philosophical vision of Nietzsche about mankind, don't you think that in the end he had great consideration and esteem of man's potential when in Also sprach Zarathustra, he declares that behind every philosophy there is an autobiography. So doing to every man the potential strength to be a philosopher and protagonist of the history and the philosophy of the world. Thank you. Well, for sure. Nietzsche reminds us of the enormous and mysterious potentiality of human beings potential. Nietzsche, before Freud, and also teaching to Freud, I don't want to say that he taught everything to Freud, but, even the problems, the discomfort of our civilization belongs to this Nietzsche's philosophy, even if Freud does not get to the consequences of Nietzsche, which will refuse the entire civilization. So if civilization will bring people to neurotic discomfort because it inhibits the primary desires of man, well, civilizing him, then it can go to hell the entire human civilization. What Freud will say, no, it's basically different. He will say the neurosis and then the inhibition of the aggressive and primary sexual instincts is inevitable to build civilization. How to say, it is an unavoidable illness, and we got to keep it. So Nietzsche reminds us that human beings are, that the history is a little blurred. We have to remember that Nietzsche has a reaction to the philosophical triumph of positivism. Bergson, Boutroux in France, in Italy there is the new idealism, so there is a reaction to what limits human beings to what is only biological, and that's why Nietzsche will say, so it will go against this positive vision of human beings, even though it will take part of Darwinism and he will also use science, but he continues to be a mystic. He believes in the mystery. He therefore defines himself a poet, a poet of Dionysus, then in contact with this mystery. If you read again Ecce Homo, the key to understand him, he will describe an invasion like, as if he's a medium towards the gods. And he is characterized by high inspiration, and this splits his personality when he says to meet Zarathustra, the one became 2 to 6,000 meters, etc. So, in my opinion, Nietzsche, to understand him very well, you must read it very carefully until the very end, and then you have to get free from it, as also Heidegger put it. So also Nietzsche said, okay, it will be very difficult to find me, but then at the same time it will be very difficult to leave me because it's so big that you have to have a very strong stomach. Zarathustra always said it takes stomachs that are used to think, walking, and walk a lot. You must walk a lot to digest Nietzsche, but in my opinion it's an inevitable passage of great nourishment. It gives you a great purification. So after reading and understanding Nietzsche, it will be very, one will be very careful to fall into some forms of moralism, falsity. So Nietzsche actually vaccinates you. So eternity is, for example, pivotal and very important in Nietzsche's thought. He never gives up on eternity. He gives up on God, but, invents the eternal return to save eternity. So I remember doing a private radio program, age 21. It was during 1976, and one of the first radios in Rome. And I would go around, and I could also meet all the living poets, all the great philosophers, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, Carcano, Bagnano, Cantoni, and I would ask everyone, but who is the thinker that could be most useful today. And the thing that surprised me the most, I was deeply in love with Nietzsche at that time, but, the majority of them will point out Nietzsche, and I also remember Pietro Primi, a Catholic philosopher, student of Gabriel Marcel, and he also said Nietzsche. But why do you love Nietzsche? You're Catholic because Nietzsche gives you back the passion for the absolute. And that's true. Yeah, it always gives me this impression. Hi, good evening, and thank you for the wonderful lesson. I want to ask you some clarification about the relationship, if there is one, between Nietzsche and Nazism. For example, I read Hitler's biography, and I never found that Hitler studied Nietzsche, but he did study a lot Schopenhauer, but there were many critics that pointed out this relationship, and then the manipulation of some of his writing from his sister in the last years. So I would like to have some clarification. This is my first question. May I ask you a second one? So the second one will be, I would like to know what Nietzsche's thought about school, because I think he wrote a short essay, so school, university, so the future. Here, these are my two questions. Thank you. Okay, Nietzsche and Nazism, I think it could take some weeks. Let's say a few things. First of all, what I'd like to read is a sentence by René Girard. René Girard, as at least someone knows, is a French anthropologist, probably one of the major living, very famous for his theory of sacrifice and victim, of the scapegoat, and for his interpretation of Christianity as the initial liberation of humanity from a sacrifice vision. During these decades that Girard has worked, he often had to face Nietzsche, and he shows undoubtedly has Nietzsche's thought legitimizes a Nazi view, ideologically Nazist view, from many points of view. Nietzsche was not a racist. On the contrary, he often spoke showing the intelligence of the Jewish people. But you listen how he can connect Christianity and Judaism as a whole, one whole thing, and how Nazism would have, after the Jewish extermination, passed to the extermination of the Christians. Because inevitably, Christian morality, even distorted throughout history, but in its very essence, is antagonist to the Nazi project, which is the project of domination and a dominion of a superior race. The Herren. This is who we are. The SS were structures philosophically upon this idea. We are the Herren. Then you also know there was an Hyperborean mythology. They thought they were the heirs of a certain line from Iran, from India. And there are still people who think that way. If you can go on the YouTube and watch some videos of the Indo-Aryan races today. The majority of these are American films, short movies that show how in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and India, there are Aryan-type race. So those blonde guys that all look German. So this was the philosophy. And 𝗟𝗓𝗓 says, the German philosopher never ceases to be the author of the only text capable of shedding lights on the monstrosities of Nazism. I mean, of course, if you want to find some text, reference point that could be linked directly to Nazism, of course you will find them in Nietzsche. And René Girard concludes, if there is a spiritual essence of this movement, it's Nietzsche expressing it. Here, René Girard is exaggerating, but there is no doubt that Dionysus against the crucifix, it's a nice motto for the SS. And it works. If you go and see what they did in certain feasts and celebrations, even erotic ones, eugenetics, certain masquerades, it looked like as if it was carnival with women dressed as backhands, men dressed, you can find this in Stefan Georg, there are others, but Nietzsche actually is the first one to claim such things. Of course, Nietzsche does not only say this, but yes, there is a philosophy, a Nazist philosophy, like Alfred Bäumler, for example, that refers precisely to Nietzsche, and there is a Nietzschean Nazi philosophical school that arose during the 20s and 30s in Germany. Those philosophers that were teaching in the university, and they were, finding all the information and elements in Nietzsche's text. And then the other one about his sister Elizabeth and brother-in-law clearly had para or neo-pre-Nazi tendencies, and therefore the collection of the willing of power that was done by his sister had specific intentions. So probably, of course, there was a selection of a certain point, an orientation of a certain point. They wanted to show more a side of Nietzsche rather than another, but without any doubt, there are some points that can support this thesis. I have here an edition dated 1922 of Ecce Homo, bought by my grandfather. If I go and see what my grandfather underlined, and my grandfather was a fascist, he did the march upon Rome, 4 wars, and he felt very comfortable within this book. Indeed, he's underlining the very right parts. Interesting, was written in 1922, this book, and it's normal. I think the philosophy of an Übermensch, the philosophy of a domination, the philosophy against the morality of the slaves, against the morality of forgiveness, of all these things that actually benefit to a certain ideological perspective that then becomes politics and then becomes social life. As far as schools and university are concerned, also there Nietzsche saw a great decline, determined essentially by the predominance of historical culture. He said, we are basically becoming a walking museum. We know the whole history of all things, but we don't have the strength to create anything new. We're buried by history. In fact, he will write the second Nattuale on the uselessness and damage of history for our lives. And he suggests that too much history is totally useless. We're also a civilization of memory, based upon memory. We store lots of stories on computers. Everything is archived, and we are, overwhelmed by this. And then actually he hated university. Because, it was made by learned people, and he resigned from university during 72. He was studying philology. He was a classical philologist, and he resigned. He had a chair at the age of 28. He was a great teacher, master. He with enormous pedagogical skills, and I think also, in my opinion, this made him, drove him crazy. He, in a certain way, he entangled himself in loneliness and hatred. In hatred that was determined by the lack of reception. Nietzsche published his books himself, actually paying a fee, and all returned back to him. So he was a bitter man. And even his friends, at the very end, will leave him. 𝗬𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗔, they no longer understand him. And the more they don't understand him, and the more he gets really angry. And the more he believes that in order to make himself understood, he has to shout and curse and not sing, you see? So there is this big tragedy. He thinks he cannot transfer all his knowledge, and he became alone and loner. And then, he, in the end, he's crazy, that it will be managed by his sister and mother, and here Freud could work on this case for a long time, just like Rimbaud runs away and ends up dying with his mother and sister. Actually, I'll tell you that one must deal with mom first. You don't have to write the Antichrist. Before doing such a great effort, you should do this. I would like to ask you, so when we'll try to listen to our heart and dreams, can't we find on the beyond man the deep longing that constitutes us as human being, which is love, justice, poetry, and art, which go beyond, the mere existence, but if they're distorted and not assumed as purely human, maybe they might seem worthless. Yes, that's exactly what I believe. I believe that if we humbly, and I speak about Nietzsche as a philosopher, because Nietzsche as a human being was very humble, but as a philosopher, not really. So if we are humble enough to really listen to what our heart deeply desires, well, in my opinion, we don't really find what Nietzsche is saying. The human heart, when is deeply listened, does not yearn for a domination, and the desire to dominate, in my opinion, also based on the work that I am bringing on groups, the longing for domination, for power, it seems to me to be a response of defense, which is to say, when our love is wounded, then perhaps we try to compensate this lack of love with power. Therefore, I don't believe at all that the essence of life is the will of power. I believe that the essence of life is the creative love. And therefore, in the heart of each one of us, there is a desire to procreate and to create loving, and loving by procreating and creating in all dimensions. And this makes us feel, in my opinion, that we are a whole and one. To reach out for this clarity and to have a contact with ourselves. So this is a job, actually, because we basically tend to be alienated for psychological and cultural reasons. And this is a struggle, and I love Nietzsche because he, is teaching you how to fight, but he is not as humble as one could be to go till the very end, so he does not recognize himself. He writes things that do not belong to him. He's talking about violence, about the will of oppression that didn't really belong to him. So why didn't he listen to his soul and let it sing? He wouldn't have cursed his life and his soul like that, because in his heart there were so many beautiful things, and within him we find this drama. And it's very interesting because his drama is also our drama, because today, even we human beings in this contemporary life, it's not very easy. And it's not simple to say what makes us feel good. We're still very complicated, and maybe we need some critical moments to understand. But sometimes these critical moments lead you to what is essential. So aristocracy and 𝗬𝗓𝗓 and what is all that, but who cares about that? But if you called, for example, your sister, oh, my sweet little llama, the animal that lived there in Tibet. So you have the heart of a girl that is in love, but recognize it and do a philosophy that can flourish from this with your own strength. Think about that. So now we're talking in abstract, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm saying this to myself when I was 21 and 22. I said to myself, I don't feel this anymore. And when I do things, I also try to do things also with my body. So I also try to live and experience what Nietzsche, for example, was saying. I'm not an intellectual. So I tried, but it didn't fulfill me. 𝗓𝗓𝗦𝗓𝗔, eroticism, contempt, they do not give me the sense of who I really am. Therefore, I said, my dear Nietzsche, goodbye. I obey to your commandment to betray you, and I start seriously to ask myself if the problem is not actually in the original archetype. If your problem, and therefore my problem, is not in what you fought all your life until you got mad, maybe it's that. Isn't that? Isn't that what makes us human? How does that human being think? Then, I began a very long journey in which I realized that human there is exactly the fullness of humanity that I'm looking for, and it contains all the hopes for me, and I can find no other. Now, just a curiosity, the relationship with the male aspects and figure, because it seems to me that his sister was way more masculine compared to Nietzsche. His brother-in-law had put on a very strange colony in Paraguay. He killed themselves in the end, and he put up this colony with a lot of people that thought they were going to be fine. Instead, they found themselves enslaved. I would like to know what is Nietzsche's relationship with the male figure, with his father, for example. I think he lost him, right? Well, this is a very important and difficult key to understand. Surely very important, definitely. Nietzsche, for sure, had relevant male friends all his life. But he did not have meaningful women. He had only one woman. However, she was very significant from an intellectual point of view. She was 𝗓𝗧𝗜𝗓, and he actually despised her because she was an immoralist while he was a Christian moralist, a rightful Christian moralist, actually to the very core, to the very bone. And so 𝗓𝗧𝗜𝗓 is the only woman that we know. And he also had the idea to be with her, to stay together with her, and then he found out that she interpreted beyond good and evil, thinking, okay, now we can do whatever we want, to be open. And there is a beautiful letter that Nietzsche wrote to her, that underlines and explains what moral and morality is. He meant beyond the good and evil was something mystical, sectical, not we do what we want, actually. As most of the people now in the 20th century, he was a very harmless man, actually. So this letter is written to 𝗬𝗚𝗟𝗟𝗔, one of his greatest friends, and he says, "This spring I believed that there was a creature capable of giving me help." And this is the first time that he writes something like this about a woman. For this reason, one do not only need a good head, but first of all, a morality of first order. Instead, I discovered a creature that wants to have fun. So go figure, huh? So he's thinking he is Dionysus, and she is bold enough to believe that the most upright spirits in the world were created for this purpose. So he's basically saying, but she's dumb. She believes that I want to have fun. Do you understand? She didn't understand. So she didn't understand. And he didn't understand 𝗓𝗧𝗜𝗓. So who could imagine that these words, heroism, fighting for an idea, his poetry, hymn to life, what he told about his struggles to get to know everything about him. So this is the only thing that we know about his relationship to a woman. Then there is also the mystery of the relationship with Cosima Wagner, who probably was nothing more than a romance, a romantic sympathy for an older woman, and he was a young infatuated with Wagner. So with no doubt, Nietzsche's had a very solitary life, unmarried, and this is also not of secondary importance. If you read what Zarathustra says about women, so go with weep. If you go to a woman, do not forget the weep. This is Zarathustra, typical of those who are afraid of women. Well, Paul says, he does not say to bring actually the weep, but he says, keep away from them. Yeah, that's right, Saint Paul. And in fact, but there were also those who thought that Nietzsche had syphilis. This is one of the hypotheses of his madness and of his chronic diseases. Maybe he had syphilis from some place. But however, apart from these very personal things, it's without any doubt that Nietzsche had a problem in psychological terms, both with male figures, so what was masculine. So there is an extreme distance between, a great difference between, the model that he proposes, the gentleman, the heron, the strength of the Romans, and he himself, who was always sick, he got stomach ache, headache, he was very frail, fragile, poor, he suffered physically to death and emotionally fragile. So we can certainly say that his male identity was not integrated with all this, and also he had many problems to be in relationship to something that was feminine. And I think these are pretty visible things in his life. He had most of all relationship with male figures, very important ones, until 𝗬𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗜𝗏, the last young musician friend. He had almost always friends that were men. Only 𝗬𝗘𝗦𝗏 seemed to have a way, but actually failed, as far as I know, miserably. Well, Wagner and his music, wow. This is also one big problem. Well, it seems one more thing. A personality full of contradictions. On one hand, we know that the young Nietzsche, when he was, talking about the birth of tragedy, he was convinced that Wagner's music was one of the instrument of Renaissance for Europe, the cultural Renaissance, the total opera. What Wagner also thought, Wagner wanted to realize a work of music that wasn't just simple about music. He wanted to synthesize all artistic forms, say theater, music, dance, painting, vision, and that this work of art would have renewed history. Also, Wagner thought about this, so he wanted just simply to think about, music. He wanted to change the world, and he also had very romantic views that were dangerous during the 50s, 60s, and 70s of the 19th century. Yes, he was an anarchist, but then we know that anarchism can also lead to different ways. Exactly. So, on one side, Nietzsche sees Wagner as a prophet for the new humanity and the renewal of the Western German world. But soon after some visits to Bayreuth, when he meets with this German world that was very heavy, actually. So when he met, he said, okay, it was too heavy. It was obnoxious, actually, to him. Terrible. Then, no, he understood that, for God's sake, they are going towards a different direction. And he will then say they're going towards, again, Christianity. So Wagner is then reaching out to Parsifal, to Eucharist, to the celebration of the Christian rites. So, Nietzsche will hate Wagner. And it will be, the same hatred that he will have towards Christ. The more it goes on, and the more he will write works against Wagner. And he will also write, in the end, that Wagner's music is music of decadence, and he loves Bizet. So, Carmen. So, the Carmen of Bizet is opposed to Parsifal, because he says we need to go back to body. I love music that is upbeat. It makes me, move, step to the ground. So actually, Wagner is terrible sometimes, okay? He's a great musician, but actually is not very easy to listen to him. So as for me, I would just, I would like to listen to Wagner as in small pieces. Okay, I will select something because some of these things are just extraordinary. The overture in Tristan is great. But then, 3 hours long, this is too much. So 5 hours, 20 is the Parsifal. So, we just need a summary of it. So one last question, and then we conclude.
C'è un'ultima domanda, poi chiudiamo.
So maybe I'll need to think over what I just heard, but I would like to bring back our discussion to how important is Nietzsche during our modern times. Many of us, actually, quite many of us think that we are experiencing now the life of the last human beings. I don't know how, after 100 years, these words that we just listened to might be decisive for our lives. I was reflecting upon the fact that the alternative between Dionysus and Christ maybe could let us think that Christianity does not end up with a crucifix but with the resurrection, and also this myth or this idea of the resurrection was never central up until a few centuries ago, when it was then the reflection was basically underlining how important was the resurrection. And they put it again in the middle of the theological reflection. On the other side, also the figure of the Antichrist. It goes back to the importance of the body, the flesh. Because the Antichrist is the one that denies that Christ embodied, that God embodied in the person and Christ and the body. So here again, this is a reflection. And for the Christians, he's forcing Christianity and the Christians and human beings. So Christ hasn't come to make people be Christian. He came to make people be human beings. Well then, from that point of view, I think that Nietzsche provokes us a lot, because we sometimes think some things are Christian but they're not, because we are used to some words and we take some words for granted when they're not. But all this work actually is an intellectual work or cultural work. It's a very difficult one. It's a work that we're not well equipped for. Just think of the Bible studies, how vast they are now in the few decades, And the great ignorance from the majority of us. So, for example, the difference between the Catechism of Pius X and John Paul II, you can understand the big difference. So culturally, of course, there is a big work to be done, and I think Nietzsche forces us to do. I am convinced, actually, that the alternative between Dionysus and Christ or the crucifix is not forcing us to choose among one Nietzsche or another Nietzsche. Because some of the reflections that I heard in Nietzsche, I think they all have something very important. I don't want to overdo. So the same reflection that I didn't know about the human sacrifice, I think that it's also decisive for human beings. I'm not in favor of human sacrifice, but I understand that Nietzsche quotes some losses in our tradition that he wanted to replace in some way.
Che si sia perso qualcosa su quel piano credo che sia vero.
Infatti, diciamo.
Yeah, we could say the same about the totalitarian regimes.
Lo potremmo dire dei totalitarismi. Cioè,
So if during the 20th century communism and fascism that then generated Nazism, they had a strange success in Europe, is because they manifested some real needs and they gave catastrophic solutions. So this is actually what maybe you wanted to say, that Nietzsche is now so modern. So why are we now here at Misano during an evening in spring, wasting our time 2 hours and a half speaking about and around Nietzsche? Because I think he's saying something that has to do with us. So totalitarian regimes, they appear at the beginning of the 20th century, following some thinking, some philosophies, among which also Nietzsche, that were saying to the Western world, well, you see, we lost something. They said also to Christianity as the soul of the Western world. From the left side, the leftist, so communism said, okay, you forgot about the sacrament of the brother, as 𝗬𝗓𝗔𝗟 points out. He died 2 months ago. A French man, he once was atheist, but then converted into Christianity. So where is the care for the sufferings, the brothers and the poor? Where is the being company? So then you have socialism, you know, the idea of company and to share the bread with the other brothers. And this is all deriving from the Christian tradition. So on one side, Christianity lost the ideal of the brother, of sharing the bread, of social justice. Well then, a political religious form is born, which is communism, that takes it all and then wins in Russia. Who understands and knows the Russian culture between the 19th, 20th century, it was a messianic culture. So they were waiting an historical renewal in a messianic way for as for justice in the justice field. So when communism wins in Russia, not in Germany, as awaited from Marx in the industrialized Germany, so well then communism answers to some real needs, and also Nazi fascism. Fascism presents himself as a renewed mystic. If you read, or if you're curious, why don't you go back and read what was written in the 𝗬𝗡𝗙𝗢𝗓𝗔, the first edition, I think it's the first edition, 1935. If you read Fascism, written by Benito Mussolini, you will find a very important author. And the first things that Mussolini is saying is that fascism is a religion. It's a religion. It's not just politics. It's a vision of the world, and it's speaking about a new humanity. We had a new calendar, like, a new era. So, first year of the fascist era, because there is a new world, a new humanity. So even fascism is taking from the crisis of Christianity a lot of heroism, of strong creativity, of the sacrifice for the goodwill, the mystic. So that's why they have this dead skull, they have the black funeral skirt, the fascists, because, to go and die, it's beautiful. So these are counter figures, anti-Christs of Christian necessities and needs. And well, this is the Antichrist, actually. It's that way, that lifestyle that anticipate the Christ. So Antichristos means that it comes before the Christ. So the Antichrist is that mankind's illusion to anticipate and force the process of his sanctity. So I read totalitarian regimes with this key. These are anticipation, forced anticipation, and so devilish of a mature process for a new humanity. When these processes die and vanish, then with the Second World War in 1989, well then we're open up again this dialogue. That's why I came here before you to have this conference about Nietzsche, because we had the illusion that after the communist regime decadence, we would go back to the 19th century politics, let's say. And that's why politics is not so courageous nowadays no more, not only in Italy, and it's very mean. Nietzsche actually foresaw the great politics, and this is how 𝗬𝗡𝗦𝗓𝗓 ends. It ends with a I'm forgetting now the page. He also spoke about the time of the new wars. There will be great wars as never seen before. That's what he wrote in 1889. So I do perfectly agree with you. Today, to confront again with Nietzsche, it must be again a way to confront with totalitarian regimes in a philosophical and spiritual way. Because, okay, it was crap and they were tragedies, but we have to understand why they were born, because otherwise we will generate them again if we don't understand the spiritual problem from which they generated. And we just say, as to simplify, okay, there were all mistakes and errors. Well, okay, what are you then saying? So why did we made that mistakes? Well, Catholicism is the origin of the crisis of Christianity. So we can say that Christianity comes to a big crisis during the 16th century with the Reform. Then, it's split in its inside. On one side, people are defending a tradition that then closes itself up in a tradition like Catholicism. And then the modern cultures as Protestantism, they separate even more from the church, and then they denied the church and even the Christian roots they're coming from. And this is the inner divorce within the European spirit that led us here today. So the modern cultures are nihilist today. They have no energy, also no political energy to move on and go on. And on the other side, Catholicism became sterile in its culture. So the divorce that Paul VI was pointed out between gospel and culture. Now, our times are also at a very end. I think that these two different structures must familiarize again. They will have to rejoin again in a transformational process, not in a diplomatic process. It's a very serious matter. We must understand what wants to be born now in us. What is the newest creature that wants to be born? And I think that Nietzsche is helping us in this confrontation. So now this is the conclusion. I thank everyone and I thank Marco Guzzi for this beautiful evening. Thank you very much.
Grazie di nuovo Marco Guzzi per la bellissima serata. L'appuntamento è per venerdì prossimo. Buonasera a tutti.